As Flight Orion 914 of Ether Sky Airways boarded its final passengers, a man in a neatly pressed military uniform stepped onto the plane, his demeanor calm yet commanding. Silas Vaughn, a black soldier, had no idea that what seemed like an ordinary flight would become a major turning point. Not just for him, but for others about to collide with a world of power they didn't even know existed. He walked lightly through the passenger cabin, moving with ease, though his eyes remained vigilant. His uniform was ironed to perfection without a single crease, and his insignia polished until it reflected the ceiling lights. Each of his steps carried a message. He was not an ordinary man. However, the eyes around him told a different story. Some were filled with respect, others with curiosity, and some with skepticism. Silas was used to it. As a seasoned soldier, he understood the cost of wearing a uniform in a society where perception often came before truth. He made his way to his seat, the first row in the first-class cabin, and gently sat down. The soft hum of the engine and the quiet conversations of nearby passengers blended into the familiar soundtrack of commercial flights. Yet, Silas sensed something was off. A female flight attendant was moving through the cabin with practiced grace and the typical courteous smile, but her eyes kept drifting toward him. Her name was Rowena Blair. Each time she passed his seat, her glance betrayed a mix of confusion and suspicion. Finally, Rowena stopped right next to him. She leaned in slightly, a polite smile on her lips, though her voice was colder than her appearance suggested. "Excuse me, sir. May I check your ticket?" Silas furrowed his brow. He had encountered no issues during check-in. Calmly, he retrieved his boarding pass from his breast pocket and handed it to her. Here he said, his voice deep and steady. Rowena took it, her eyes scanning the information before she looked up at him again, her expression doubtful. "First class?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "That's right," he replied crisply, his gaze unwavering. She remained silent for a long moment, as if searching for a flaw in the ticket. Then she handed it back, lips tightly pressed. "Very well," she said coldly, turning away without another word. Her attitude left a sour aftertaste. Silas was no stranger to judgmental looks or subtle discrimination, but Rowena's reaction wasn't just a simple mistake. It felt like a deliberate check. As she moved further down the cabin, he caught her glancing toward another flight attendant. A quick nod, a subtle frown. Clearly, they were discussing something about him. Not long after the plane took off, the engines roared softly as they pierced through thick clouds. But instead of relaxing into the flight, Silas felt something was wrong. The discomfort didn't stem from altitude or cabin pressure, but from the sideways glances laden with implication. Meanwhile, Rowena continued her duties, pouring drinks, smiling, checking on passengers, but her smile had lost its authenticity. It was forced, hollow. Each time she passed Silas, she stared at him intently, then quickly looked away as if afraid to be caught. He remained silent, showing no reaction. Soldiers like him had learned to restrain, to read a room without giving anything away. But that didn't mean he wasn't feeling it. The tension between the two of them was like a taut string stretched to its limit. Then Rowena returned once more. This time, she wasn't moving with the brisk efficiency of a working flight attendant. She walked slowly, deliberately. Silas straightened his back. He sensed something was coming. Something bad. Rowena Blair's gait was no longer quick and graceful as usual. Something had changed. Each of her steps now carried a sense of resolve, an intention that was impossible to ignore. When she stopped in front of the row where Silas Vaughn was seated, he instinctively sat up straighter. A chill running down his spine, she stood blocking his line of sight, her body slightly tilted, eyes fixed on his calm face. "Mr. Vaughn, I need to speak with you for a moment," she said, not loudly, but clearly, her voice sharp like a finely honed blade. Silas raised an eyebrow, surprised that she had approached him again. Something wasn't right. Still, he maintained his composed demeanor. "Very well," he replied evenly, though unease had already begun to stir within him. Rowena gestured for him to rise and follow her toward the galley, the section separated from the passengers. As he walked down the aisle, the air in the cabin seemed to grow thicker. Eyes followed him. Whispered voices rippled out like waves, especially from the flight attendant crew. Though no words were clearly spoken, the exchanged glances and quick looks said enough. Silas kept his face composed even as turmoil churned inside. He knew one thing for certain. This was no longer about verifying his seat. This was a calculated strike rooted in prejudice. When they reached the galley, Rowena turned to face him. Her posture was upright, her face expressionless, but the chill in her eyes was enough to make the air feel tense. "I'm sorry, but I need you to change seats," she said, her voice cold as ice. "There appears to have been an error with your booking." Silas's eyes widened, disbelief washing over him. "An error?" he asked. "I booked this ticket weeks ago, and all the information is clearly confirmed." "I've double-checked," Rowena responded, her tone growing firmer. "This seat is not suitable for you. There's one available in the back of the economy cabin." The words hit like an invisible blow. Silas felt the blood rush to his face. He nearly spoke out in protest, but stopped himself. Not out of fear, but because he knew this wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate act, and the woman standing before him had judged him based solely on appearance. He looked at her eyes, calm yet piercing. "I don't understand. My ticket is fully valid. Why must I move?" His tone remained steady even as a storm surged within. But Rowena didn't answer. She turned and walked away, assuming he would follow. And he did. Silas picked up his bag and made his way to the rear of the plane, feeling every eye land on him. The surrounding passengers didn't understand what was happening, but the abrupt and unusual change had captured their attention. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin. Quiet but sharp like needles, Silas walked with steady steps. He didn't bow his head, he didn't feel regret, he wasn't angry, but he wouldn't forget. He knew this was no longer about a seat. It was a message of insult steeped in bias. But what Rowena Blair didn't know was this. She had just picked the wrong man to target. He took his seat in the economy cabin, a cramped space that did not reflect the first-class ticket he had paid for. He stowed his bag under the seat back, straight hands steady. He didn't need to raise his voice. He had his own way. Passengers nearby began to whisper. Some showed sympathy. Others looked confused. Though no one said it aloud, everyone sensed something was wrong. Meanwhile, Rowena returned to the front cabin, continuing her work as if nothing had happened. She poured drinks, smiled, checked on passengers, but that smile had lost its truth. It was thin as paper, trembling each time her eyes involuntarily drifted to the back of the plane. Every time she saw Silas still sitting there, composed and calm, a strange feeling stirred inside her, part regret, part unease. She didn't want to admit it, but Rowena was beginning to feel she had been wrong. At first her actions had seemed reasonable. It was an instinctive decision. She had assumed that a black man in uniform couldn't possibly belong in first class. An unconscious assumption. A deep-seated bias. She hadn't thought much of it when she asked him to switch seats. She didn't think it was offensive. She believed she was doing her duty. But now, seeing his upright posture, his still gaze, and his unshakable composure, she began to panic. The passengers in first class, too, began to sense something. They exchanged confused glances. No one spoke, but the air grew cold. A few people started to question what just happened. No one knew exactly, but everyone felt something wasn't right. Although she had returned to her duties, Rowena Blair couldn't shake the growing discomfort swelling inside her. She forced a smile to remain on her lips as she walked past the rows of seats, but her eyes kept drifting almost involuntarily toward the back of the cabin where Silas Vaughn was seated. Suddenly, the familiar hum of the aircraft's PA system sounded, signaling an announcement from the cockpit. The calm, steady voice of Captain Dorian Pierce filled the cabin, reminding passengers of the standard safety procedures. But to Rowena, it was nothing more than background noise amid the storm of thoughts swirling in her mind. There was something about Silas she couldn't stop thinking about. His composure, the way he didn't react angrily when asked to switch seats. It was completely unlike most people. She had encountered hundreds of passengers, many of whom would explode over a delayed drink. But this man was different. Could he be more than just a soldier? The thought flickered through her mind, and she quickly dismissed it. No way, she told herself. Still, suspicion burned quietly like an ember. Unable to resist, Rowena pulled out her phone, her hands trembling slightly as she unlocked it. She accessed Ether Sky Airways' internal seating system and searched for the full name of the passenger. Her eyes quickly scanned the list, and then froze. A bolded name appeared. Silas Vaughn. A breathless silence, she went numb. Silas Vaughn, a name well known in business and media circles. The current owner of Ether Sky Airways. A former Special Forces veteran once featured on magazine covers for his investment strategies and large-scale philanthropy. A powerful, private man who disliked the spotlight, Rowena's hand dropped. Her phone nearly slipped from her grasp. A cold wave rushed down her spine. What had she done? She had just kicked the owner of the airline out of first class because he was wearing a military uniform. She shoved her phone back into her pocket. Heart pounding, her mind spun wildly. A cascade of questions crashed into her thoughts. Is he angry? Will he report this to the company? Am I going to be fired? Do I still have a chance to fix this? Each one sliced into her like a sharp blade. She returned to the cabin, walking past the rows of seats holding a tray of water, nearly without noticing it. Every motion became mechanical. Every smile was forced. Inside, she was unraveling, but Silas Vaughn remained the same. Seated upright, silent as if he had known all along this would happen. He showed no anger, no complaint. He didn't even look at her with reproach, and that made Rowena even more unsettled. His calmness was a silent storm, and she knew that people like him were the most dangerous of all. Her mind was a mess. Every time she passed Silas's row, she felt stripped bare. A silent verdict delivered without a word, she began to recall every action from the start of the flight. The way she doubted him, interrogated him, then sent him away just because of a bias. She hadn't checked any information. She had simply seen the uniform, the color of his skin, and made a decision rooted in arrogance. The murmurs in the cabin were growing louder. A few passengers in first class had begun to notice that something was off. They exchanged puzzled glances. The earlier calm had vanished, replaced by an undercurrent of murmuring tension. Some passengers had witnessed how Rowena treated Silas. They recognized how unreasonable it was, and now they were asking questions not just about her actions, but about the man seated at the back of the plane. Rowena began to feel afraid. She could barely focus on her duties. Anxiety made her hands clumsy as she poured water for a passenger. Her hand trembled slightly, and a few drops splashed onto the person's shirt. She quickly apologized, but the tension in her expression didn't escape anyone's notice. Then the PA system chimed again. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for choosing to fly with Ether Sky Airways today. If you require assistance, please notify the nearest crew member." Captain Pierce's familiar voice echoed once more, but Rowena barely heard it. Her mind was filled with only one name: Silas Vaughn. With every passing second, the dread inside her grew. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message. She pulled it out and looked, and her heart nearly stopped. An internal notification from the airline's executive office. She stared at the screen. Her breath caught in her throat. The message was brief. "Passenger Silas Vaughn is aboard your flight. A full report on his treatment is required immediately upon landing. Please report to the galley immediately. This is an urgent matter." The internal announcement from the intercom drained the life out of Rowena Blair. Each word struck her mind like a blow. No one had to explain. It was clear she had stepped into dangerous territory, and the worst was yet to come. She clenched her fists to steady herself, her legs heavy as stone as she walked toward the rear of the cabin. A flood of dark scenarios filled her mind. Do I still have a chance to make this right? Does the company know if he reports it, will I be suspended? When she arrived, Michael Hayes, the flight supervisor, was already there waiting. His eyes weren't angry, but they were so deep and unreadable they sent a chill through her. He didn't speak, just quietly handed her the intercom phone. "Someone wants to speak with you." Her hands trembled as she took it, lifting the receiver to her ear with a sinking feeling. A voice on the other end came through, calm, composed, but unmistakably grave. "This is the operations office of Ether Sky Airways. We have just received a report regarding a first-class passenger being relocated on your current flight. Please prepare a detailed incident report upon landing." Rowena felt her throat go dry. She could barely speak. "I'm sorry. I don't quite understand. What is this about?" She stammered, a brief silence. Then the voice continued clearer now, cold as a final verdict. "The passenger you reassigned. His name is Silas Vaughn. He is the owner of this airline." Her entire body went rigid. Each word crashed into her like a death knell. Silas Vaughn. Not just any passenger, not just another soldier. He was the man at the top, the one with the power to end her career with a single word. She felt all strength drain from her body. Her breathing turned shallow. Her eyes stared blankly into the air as if hoping this was only a nightmare. But it wasn't. The truth was laid bare before her in the most brutal way. She recalled every detail and the way she demanded to see his ticket. Her cold tone, the suspicious look in her eyes, every action driven by bias, by the reflex to judge a book by its cover. On the other end of the line, the voice continued. "You need to understand the seriousness of this situation. Mr. Vaughn is not just an influential passenger. He is the heart of this company. His experience is our highest priority." Those words splashed ice water on Rowena's thoughts, snapping her back to reality. She knew who Silas Vaughn was, who didn't. He was on the news and financial reports at the helm of charitable initiatives. A quiet but powerful investor. A man to be respected, and now a man she had just insulted. She set the receiver down on the counter, her fingers still clenched tightly, her chest aching. The air in the galley grew suffocating. Michael Hayes said nothing, but his eyes said everything. A slight nod, a silent stare. All of it only made her feel smaller, guiltier. "You know, this isn't something small, don't you?" Michael asked, his voice low and heavy. Rowena didn't respond right away. She was trying to regain her composure, but her mind still spun. Not just because of the mistake, but because of the price she would have to pay for it. "I didn't know. I really didn't know who he was," she whispered as if trying to justify herself. But the words rang hollow. They meant nothing. Now not when the harm had already been done, not when prejudice had guided her to an irreversible act. Michael nodded slowly. "You made a big mistake, Rowena, and I can only hope he's generous enough not to ruin your career over it." She swallowed hard. The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. Their weight was tenfold, because they came from someone seasoned, someone who understood the real consequences of crossing men like Silas Vaughn. Rowena stepped back, her eyes unfocused as she stared into the void. She knew things had spiraled far beyond her control, and now the only thing left to do was prepare for the storm that was coming. The atmosphere in the galley was oppressively heavy. Rowena Blair tried to focus on her colleagues as they moved around her with quiet, professional composure. She stood pressed into a corner, hands gripping the edge of the counter, her mind drifting through the consequences of her mistake. She had lost control. What had happened was beyond her ability to undo. All she could do now was hope this wouldn't take away everything she had worked so hard to build. The plane continued gliding silently through the sky. Rowena forced herself to return to her duties, serving drinks, greeting passengers with strained artificial smiles. But each time she passed the row where Silas Vaughn was seated, it felt as though a dark cloud hovered above. He did nothing, just sat calmly, his face serene as if the events that had just unfolded hadn't touched him at all. But Rowena knew better. That was just the surface. A storm was coming, and it would show her no mercy. With each passing moment, the weight of her mistake grew heavier in Rowena's every step. Her once confident posture had disappeared. Her movements became stiff, awkward, as if every stride carried the burden of her anxiety. Her smile, too, had become a mask, an awkward, forced expression worn just to fulfill her role. Every time she walked past Silas, she felt as though his eyes were quietly tracking her. Every move silent, cold, but razor-sharp, like a thin blade grazing the skin. The atmosphere in the cabin began to shift as well. Passengers who had been absorbed in movies, dozing off, or reading were now beginning to murmur. The tension in the flight crew's behavior, especially Rowena's, was no longer hidden. A few passengers in first class turned to glance toward the economy cabin. Their eyes were curious. Some watched Rowena's expressions closely, noting her trembling hands as she poured water or the furtive glances she stole toward Silas each time she passed. The clock neared midnight. Whispers crawled down the aisle like an underground current. No one knew exactly what had happened, but everyone could sense something was wrong. Rowena knew it too, and that only added to her unease. She began replaying worst-case scenarios over and over in her head. Will he sue me? Can he demand that I be fired? Do I still have a chance to fix this? Each time she thought of Michael Hayes's warning, her heart clenched tighter. You better hope you haven't crossed the kind of man you shouldn't have." That sentence echoed in her mind like a fateful chorus. Rowena knew she had crossed a dangerous line. She had judged that man by his appearance, and the price for that mistake was beginning to take shape. The plane continued forward like an invisible arrow, and every time her eyes caught a glimpse of Silas Vaughn, a black man dressed in military uniform calmly seated in the middle of the economy cabin, her heartbeat faltered. He wasn't angry, he didn't complain, but it was precisely that silence that frightened her most. Silas seemed to be waiting, not waiting to retaliate, but for the perfect moment to strike with precision. The thought made Rowena shudder. Elsewhere on the plane, Silas Vaughn still sat silently. He could sense the shifting atmosphere and he could feel Rowena's anxious gaze on him, but he revealed nothing. For years, he had mastered the art of suppressing anger, especially in situations steeped in injustice like this. He was used to judgment, used to suspicious stares simply because of his skin color, but he had never let it shake him. Today would be no different. He knew he held the power now, and he knew exactly when to act. The phone in his pocket buzzed softly. Silas took it out and looked at the screen. A message from Jared, his personal assistant. "Everything is ready. Just give the word." A faint smile played at the corner of his lips. There was nothing left to worry about. Everything had been arranged. This incident, however small it might seem, would not be ignored. Not with his position, and certainly not when a first-class passenger had been treated as undeserving based solely on prejudice. Meanwhile, Rowena was still caught in a whirlwind of emotion. She paced the cabin, serving passengers, but each time she passed the center aisle where Silas sat, her chest tightened. Regret and fear were suffocating her. She didn't know what was going to happen next. But there was one thing she was certain of. She wasn't going to escape it. Rowena Blair's life was teetering on the edge of change. As the plane continued gliding through the night sky, she realized she could no longer focus. The once soothing hum of the engines, an ambient sound that used to bring her comfort, now grated on her nerves. Each minute dragged on endlessly as though time itself was dragging her closer to an unpredictable fate. A distinct feeling rose in her chest. Something big was about to happen. Her reputation, career, and everything she had worked tirelessly to build were now under threat, all because of one rash decision rooted in a surface-level judgment. At the front of the aircraft, Silas Vaughn still sat with an air of tranquility, his gaze untroubled as though nothing had happened. It was that very calmness that made Rowena's unease swell. How could he remain so composed after everything? She wondered if he knew something she didn't. It felt like he was simply waiting for the moment. Everything collapsed, and he was right. Passengers in first class, once absorbed in movies or casual conversations, were beginning to pay more attention. Rowena could feel the whispers behind her back, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. Every step she took now felt scrutinized, dissected. As she passed Silas once more, a knot twisted in her stomach. He remained firmly seated in economy class, while she was the one struggling to survive each minute of mounting tension. His silence unsettled her more than any confrontation would have. But that wasn't all. A new thought struck her, one that made her heart pound. Had he made a call? Had he contacted the highest levels of leadership? The idea struck her like a jolt of icy electricity. She glanced at her colleagues and saw the same quiet, curious looks cast in her direction. They felt it too. The tension was rising. The chime of the intercom interrupted her thoughts. The captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for flying with us today. If you require assistance, please contact any member of our cabin crew." It was a routine announcement, but today it only made the atmosphere more suffocating. Rowena tried to focus on preparing the next beverage service, but her mind kept drifting back to the man in the center aisle. Just as she entered the galley, the fixed phone began to ring. She glanced at the display. The screen read Executive Office. Her hand froze mid-air. This wasn't a routine call. She knew it was serious. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the receiver. "This is Rowena." A firm voice responded. "We've just received a report about a first-class passenger being reassigned. You are to report to the captain immediately. You need to face this matter directly." She didn't need to ask who they were referring to, Silas Vaughn. The man who had turned this entire flight upside down without uttering a single word. She hurried toward the cockpit, heart pounding with fear. Michael Hayes was already waiting outside, his face stern. He didn't say a word, but his expression told her everything. This was no longer a small matter. "Brace yourself, Rowena," Michael said slowly. "This is far bigger than you think." She nodded, her throat bone dry. She had misjudged everything and now had to face the consequences. Standing before the cockpit door, Rowena could feel her heart racing wildly. Each step felt like it carried the weight of lead. There was no turning back now. She raised her hand and grasped the handle. When she stepped inside, Captain Robert Evans, known in the aviation world by the nickname Harris, turned to look at her, his eyes calm and cold. "Have a seat, Rowena," he said, voice steady. She sat in the chair across from him, her knees trembling slightly. "Rowena," he continued, "do you know who the passenger you reassigned actually is?" She nodded, her throat tightening like a noose. "Yes, sir. I just found out. It's Silas Vaughn." Rowena Blair's voice echoed in the cockpit, soft as a confession. Captain Robert Evans kept his face composed, but a flicker of concern passed through his eyes. His tone dropped, now tinged with unease. "Do you understand the seriousness of this? Silas Vaughn isn't just an ordinary passenger. He holds the controlling stake in this airline, and he does not tolerate disrespect." The words hit Rowena like a punch to the chest. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding. Every cell in her body struggled to stay calm, but it was impossible. "I didn't know," she whispered, nearly losing her voice. "I thought he was just a regular soldier. I never meant to offend him." Captain Evans' gaze was sharp and cold. "Assumptions like that can destroy a career. You didn't just offend a passenger, you disrespected the actual owner of this airline." He sat upright, voice firm. "After we land, this incident will be addressed. I need you to prepare a full written report. From there, leadership will make a decision." A lump formed in Rowena's throat. She had heard of flight attendants being fired for much less. She had never imagined she'd be next in line for that storm. Every small action she had taken was now under the microscope. Robert Evans stood up, his expression softening just slightly, but his tone remained icy. "Return to your duties, Rowena. But understand this. This isn't something we can overlook. Silas Vaughn doesn't let things slide." She gave a slight nod and stepped out of the cockpit on trembling legs. The captain's words echoed in her mind. Every step she took felt heavier. She had set off a chain reaction that could no longer be stopped. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes drifted toward the back where Silas Vaughn still sat, his posture unchanged, calm, silent. but his very presence seemed to thicken the air around him. Rowena felt as though she were walking on thin ice, one misstep away from it, cracking beneath her. Back in the galley, she tried to resume her tasks, pouring drinks, smiling, speaking with passengers, but nothing came naturally anymore. Every motion, every word felt forced. In her mind, Captain Evans' words played over and over like a haunting refrain. There was no way to undo what had already been done. She glanced again toward the back of the cabin. Silas was still gazing out the window. To others, he might have looked like just another passenger, but to her he was a constant reminder of her snap judgment and of a power that far exceeded her understanding. Deep inside, Rowena began to truly grasp the gravity of what she was facing. The other flight attendants, once cheerful, chatty, during breaks, were now distant. No one asked how she was. No one offered comfort. Only quiet avoidance and curt, expressionless nods. From across the cabin, Michael Hayes looked at her. In his eyes was a mix of concern and disappointment. No one had to say a word, but everyone knew something had happened. The rumor had already spread through the cabin. What they didn't yet know was that the person involved was Silas Vaughn, someone they had assumed was just a retired soldier. Meanwhile, Silas remained seated, unmoving. He hadn't spoken a word, but that silence drew all eyes to him. Everyone could sense the aura that radiated from him, a calm authority commanding without saying a thing. No one needed to say it out loud. Rowena Blair knew she had stepped into a storm of her own making. The passengers' gazes were turning more scrutinizing. Some seemed sympathetic, others curious, but they all shared the same sense. Something had gone seriously wrong on this flight. She was no longer the graceful, composed flight attendant she usually was. She was just a shaken woman, trying to maintain composure in the middle of an earthquake. At the rear of the cabin, Silas Vaughn remained seated, his eyes looking out the window as if the chaos around him hadn't touched him. But Rowena knew the truth. His calm was not accidental, it was deliberate. It was absolute control from a man who understood his power and was preparing to strike not loudly, but in a way that would never be forgotten. He didn't need to raise his voice. He just needed to wait. Before boarding, one call from Silas to his personal assistant, Jade Coleman, had set everything in motion. The latest message had arrived on his phone exactly 41 minutes and 19 seconds ago. Everything is arranged. Just give the signal. A flicker of satisfaction passed over Silas's lips. Not because he wanted revenge, but because he knew things like this shouldn't be ignored. Without action, prejudice would repeat itself, not just for him, but for many others. Meanwhile, Rowena walked past rows of seats, checking passengers' seat belts before landing. Her smile was forced, her movements robotic. Every glance, whether polite or accidental, made her feel like she was on trial. Her chest tightened as the seatbelt sign illuminated in red. A once familiar sound now felt like a warning bell. Her mind replayed every detail. The moment she asked for his ticket, the doubt in her eyes. When she made him leave first class, his gaze as he followed her to economy. All of it was vivid, and there was no way back. Michael Hayes, the flight supervisor, stood at the back of the cabin watching her from a distance. He said nothing, but his eyes were filled with worry and disappointment. Rowena knew, though nothing was said aloud. Everyone in the crew already knew news traveled faster than the wind, and she was the eye of the storm. As for Silas, he was in complete control of timing. He didn't need to speak or overreact. For him, silence was the sharpest blade. He knew Rowena was drowning in guilt. He didn't need to push further. She passed by him once again. She didn't dare look directly, but she could feel his presence strong, unshakable, like invisible pressure pressing down on her. Her heart pounded. Each step felt like walking a cliff's edge. What would happen once the plane landed? Would she lose her job? Would she be sued, or worse, would her reputation, the one she had built so carefully for years, collapse because of one impulsive act? On the overhead panel, the sign, "Prepare for Landing," lit up. Passengers adjusted their seats, buckled seat belts, and closed meal trays. But to Rowena, every second was crushing. The roar of the engines no longer lulled her. It was a countdown to the judgment she'd face once the plane touched down. She glanced back at Silas one last time. He hadn't moved an inch. He was the embodiment of a reckoning she could not avoid. Captain Robert Evans' voice echoed one final time before landing. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are preparing for landing. Thank you for flying with us. Please fasten your seat belts and remain seated." To most passengers, it was the end of a journey. To Rowena, it was the beginning of a long chain of consequences. When the plane touched down and the wheels kissed the runway gently. But inside her, a tremor exploded. She sank into a seat in the galley, fingers gripping the armrest until her knuckles turned white. She felt herself falling into a void no one could pull her from. No one said anything to her afterward. People only looked quietly, distantly, or with pity. But only one gaze made her feel truly exposed, the gaze of Silas Vaughn. Not angry, not condemning, just a silence so powerful it stripped her bare. When the airplane doors opened and passengers began to disembark, Rowena stood motionless beside the exit. She was required to bid each person farewell as usual. But when Silas approached her, heart nearly stopped. He paused, looked directly at her, and spoke in a voice soft enough for her ears alone. "Think very carefully about how you see people from now on." Then he walked away. No more words, no turning back, only the quiet earthquake left behind enough to alter the course of a person's life forever. The atmosphere in the cabin seemed frozen as the descent light blinked on the overhead display. The familiar announcement came from Captain Robert Evans's steady voice, reminding passengers to fasten their seat belts and stow their tray tables. But for Rowena Blair, each word struck like a death knell, counting down the final moments of the career she had worked so hard to build. She forced herself back to the galley, searching for a shred of composure. But as soon as she arrived, a familiar voice landed like a punch to the chest. "Rowena." Michael Hayes, the flight supervisor, stood there, his face tight with concern. "The captain wants to see you. Right now." Her heart clenched. There was no turning back. Even if she wanted to delay it, she knew the moment of reckoning had come. Each step toward the front of the plane weighed down her entire body. When she reached the cockpit door, Robert Evans was waiting. Gone was his usual calm. In its place, a piercing stare that saw right through her. He didn't need to shout his eyes alone, made her feel exposed in the eye of the storm. "We need to talk." She nodded, stepped in, and the door closed behind her with a soft click, cold as a prison lock. "I'll be direct," Robert began. "The executive office has received an official complaint from Silas Vaughn. He's not just a passenger, I know." Rowena stammered, her voice catching in her throat. "No, you don't." He cut in. "Silas is the majority shareholder of this airline. He's a person of significant influence, not just in aviation." Each word dropped like a judge's gavel. She had known the truth, but hearing it from the captain's mouth made it all brutally real. "The board has been notified, and this will not simply end with an apology. His voice remained calm but resolute. "You'll be required to submit a full written report. Every aspect will be investigated. Disciplinary action is not off the table." The final line hit her like the last blade against a mind already cracking. She tried to breathe evenly, but the air felt too thick. She understood what he was really saying. This wasn't just a procedural mistake. It was a stain that could destroy everything she had built. As the plane neared touchdown, she felt herself turning to stone. Every movement of the landing gear kissing the runway pounded against her chest. This was not just an end. It was the beginning of one. She had no idea what awaited her next, only that nothing would ever be the same. The seatbelt chime rang out. Passengers began collecting their belongings, chatting idly, but in Rowena's mind it all seemed distant. All she could feel was the emptiness swelling inside her, a place once filled with confidence and pride. She performed her final duties as a flight attendant, checking rows, unlocking the cabin door. But every glance seemed to fall on her as if they all already knew. No one said a word, but Rowena felt it. The air had shifted. She was the center of attention now, and not in a way anyone would ever want. At the back of the cabin, Silas Vaughn rose calmly. He slipped on his coat, picked up his suitcase, his face composed as if nothing had happened. But Rowena knew beneath that calm was a rising tide about to wash everything away. She tried not to meet his eyes as he approached the exit. But Silas stopped. He looked at her, not with a smile, not with anger, just with words that floated like a breeze. "I hope from now on you'll see people with your heart, not your prejudice." It wasn't punishment. It was a verdict. When Silas's figure disappeared through the VIP boarding gate, Rowena felt her body dissolve. Everything was over. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to hold on to. Only the truth and the consequences waiting just beyond the terminal. Rowena Blair stepped out of the aircraft with trembling legs, trying to maintain a calm expression. But when she heard the voice calling from behind her, heart nearly stopped. "Are you Emily Thompson?" asked one of the two men in airport security uniforms, his tone calm but full of authority. Rowena turned around, her throat dry. She nodded slightly, lips quivering as she replied, "Yes, that's me. We need you to come with us for a moment," the other said. "There's something that needs clarification." All eyes in the arrival area seemed to converge on her. The whispers began again. In that moment, she could already imagine the rumors spreading like wildfire. "That's the flight attendant who insulted the airline's owner." Walking between the two officers, Rowena felt as though every step was pulling her farther away from her old life, a life built with years of effort, now at risk of collapsing in just a few hours. Upon entering a small, cold interrogation room, she was asked to sit on a lone chair in front of a wooden table. She complied, hands still trembling, heart pounding like a war drum. A long silence stretched out before one of the officers finally spoke. "We've received a report regarding Flight 287. Can you explain your actions during that flight?" Rowena parted her lips, but no words came out at first. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I reassigned a passenger from first class to economy," she said, her voice fading. "I thought there was an issue with the booking." The officer didn't respond right away. He looked at her intently, as if urging her to fully grasp the gravity of her words. "You moved him because you thought he didn't belong there?" he asked again, slow and sharp. She nodded, her voice cracking. "I thought he was just a soldier." Another pause. Do you know who that passenger was? Rowena shook her head, her insides in turmoil, I found out later. The officer leaned forward, his gaze icy. The person you reassigned was Silas Vaughn, the owner of this airline, a major shareholder and a senior executive. Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done? It felt like the blood in Rowena's veins stopped flowing. The room seemed to shrink closing in around her. I didn't know. I didn't mean to, she stammered. The officer raised a hand to cut her off. Intent is not the issue. This isn't just a procedural error. You've offended one of the most important figures in the company. The board has been notified and is reviewing the entire incident. Consequences are inevitable. She sat frozen, her hands cold on her lap. The world around her spun. She had thought she was simply following procedure, verifying seat assignments, ensuring passenger compliance. But in truth, it had been an act of prejudice, a bias that was now tearing her life apart. The officer lowered his voice gentler but still stern. You'll need to submit a full report and prepare yourself. The company will be handling this matter with the utmost seriousness. Afterward, the two men left the room. Rowena remained alone. She didn't remember how long she sat there, only that each passing second felt like she was being swallowed by regret. She buried her face in her hands. No tears came, but a numbness took over. I've destroyed everything. Those words repeated in her mind like a bitter refrain. She no longer knew what was coming next, only that everything had changed forever. In that silent room where every trace of hope had vanished, Rowena Blair finally understood a single moment of prejudice. One unconscious decision could destroy an entire future. And the name Silas Vaughn, the man she once assumed didn't belong in first class, was now the one holding her fate in his hands. Rowena Blair had never felt her world so fragile. She once thought it was just a small mistake, a habitual decision without malice. But now she understood it was far more serious. The weight of the name Silas Vaughn had swept away whatever innocent assumptions still lingered in her mind like a tidal wave. She recalled the moment he handed over his boarding pass, his calm eyes, his composed voice. At that moment, she hadn't once considered that she was facing a man who could completely change her life. A man who not only had a seat on the flight, but held power over the entire airline. She had been wrong, and she knew she would have to pay the price. A vibration from the phone in her pocket made Rowena flinch. A message from her superior, short but sharp as a blade. Be in the office early tomorrow. HR will be present in the meeting. Her hand dropped heart heavy as lead. The machinery of the company's internal response was now turning, and she was just a tiny cog caught in its grinding gears. She had once feared losing her job. But now, what suffocated her even more was the realization she had acted out of prejudice and unconscious judgment. She had made Silas Vaughn, a soldier, and also the chairman of the company, feel unwelcome in a seat he entirely deserved. Everything was falling apart. That night, she couldn't sleep. The images, the words, the expressions all replayed in her mind like a film with no end. And, at the first light of dawn, Rowena was at the HR office, eyes sunk in her steps, hesitant. The stark, windowless meeting room felt like a void swallowing her. Two senior representatives from HR were already seated, their expressions grim. Rowena, one of them, began motioning her to sit. We've reviewed your report and spoken to the relevant parties. This is a serious matter, and the company is treating it with the highest level of urgency. Rowena nodded. She had known this moment would come, but when it truly arrived, she still couldn't stop her hands from trembling. Disciplinary measures were laid out. She listened, but barely absorbed the words. Everything became a blur, lost in the storm raging in her mind. Temporary suspension, internal review, possible reassignment, even the possibility of permanent termination depending on the final conclusion. The meeting ended quickly. As she stepped out of the room, Rowena knew her dream of flying among the clouds might have already come to an end. That afternoon, sitting in her car, she received another email, this time from the executive office. The words made her heart sink. Mr. Silas Vaughn has requested a personal meeting. It has been scheduled for tomorrow at 2 p.m. in the executive boardroom. She sat in stunned silence. One question echoed in her mind. Why does he want to see me? She had thought the matter would be left to the board, but no. The man she had publicly diminished now wanted to look her in the eye and hear her reason for doing so. The next day, Rowena Blair stood in front of the grand glass building, the Airline's headquarters, a place she had once felt proud to work for. Each step toward the meeting room felt endless. Every light, every gleaming surface reflected the fear surging inside her. She had never set foot in the executive wing. It had always been a different world, the realm of suits and high-stakes decisions, not for someone like her. The glass doors slid open as she stepped in. Inside was a long walnut boardroom table, leather chairs, soft golden lighting, and at the head of the table sat Silas Vaughn, quietly watching her. He was dressed as simply as he had been on the plane, a white shirt, khaki pants, no tie. Yet his presence exuded undeniable authority. His eyes met hers, not with anger, not with contempt, but with a chilling calm. "Please have a seat," he said. Rowena sat down. Her hands clasped tightly to still the tension. No one spoke at first, only the hum of the air conditioner and the thudding of her own heartbeat filled the silence. Finally, he spoke. "You know who I am now, don't you?" "Yes," she whispered. "I know. And I'm sorry." "What hurt me," he said slowly, "wasn't being moved to economy class. It was the way you looked at me, the way society still looks at people like me." Rowena lowered her head. His words weren't loud, but they pierced straight through her. "I used to be a soldier. I've slept on cold ground, eaten rations in bunkers. I've worn a uniform and been glared at when I walked into upscale restaurants. I'm used to it, but I didn't expect someone to carry that same prejudice onto a flight built with my own heart and labor." Silas Vaughn paused, eyes locked on hers. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for respect. And not just for me, for everyone who's ever been looked down upon because of how they look." Rowena looked up, her eyes welling with tears. "I was wrong. I had no right to treat you that way. I acted on instinct. But now I see that instinct was poisoned from somewhere deep inside." He nodded slightly. "I don't want you to lose your job. But I do want you to change. Truly change. Not just because you're afraid of the consequences, but because you know what the right thing is." She nodded, choked with emotion. For the first time in days, she no longer felt like she was falling. She felt hope, and she knew, if given a second chance, she would never make that mistake again. Rowena Blair stepped into the executive boardroom with trembling legs. Though the receptionist smiled warmly, she still felt surrounded by a cold light, the light of judgment and fear. At the head of the long, glass-covered table, Silas Vaughn was already seated, composed, his eyes devoid of emotion. When their eyes met, a chill ran down Rowena's spine. She had faced difficult situations before, but never one like this where the person harmed by her actions was also the one who could determine the fate of her career with a single sentence. "Please have a seat," Silas said, his voice calm, not raised, not harsh, and yet the stillness in his tone made Rowena feel as though the entire room was closing in on her. After a few seconds of silence, Silas finally spoke. "I know you're tired. I'm not here to condemn you, but I want to hear your real reason. Why did you decide to move me?" Rowena swallowed hard. She knew this was the moment of truth. No beating around the bush, no excuses. "I looked at you and assumed you didn't belong in business class," she said quietly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I thought I was correcting a seating error, but I was wrong. I judged you based on how you looked, and that was disrespectful." Silas nodded slowly. "So, what have you learned from this?" he asked, his gaze fixed on her as if trying to see through the last wall of defense she had left. Rowena took a deep breath. "I've learned that even a small prejudice can cause deep harm, that we owe people respect, regardless of how they look or what job they do, and that sometimes unconscious bias can be just as cruel as intentional harm." Silas remained silent for a while. Then he spoke again, his voice softer. "That's a good start. I believe in second chances. But you also need to understand that this didn't just hurt me. It affected the reputation of the entire company. How you handle things from here on out will determine your future here." Rowena nodded, saying nothing more. She knew an apology wouldn't be enough. Only action would prove her sincerity. The meeting ended without a definitive verdict. But the look in Silas's eyes as he left the boardroom gave Rowena a sliver of hope that she might still have a chance to make things right. That evening, sitting at her computer in her small apartment, Rowena began drafting an official apology letter to Silas Vaughn. No embellishments, no justifications, just the most honest words she could write. "I was wrong. I'm sorry. And I'm working to make sure I never repeat that mistake again." As soon as she hit send, her phone chimed. A message from her superior, Mr. Silas, has decided not to pursue legal action. You will be reinstated, but must complete a training program on diversity and customer service conduct. Rowena sank into her chair, exhaling deeply. A second chance. The next morning, she arrived at the training session. No one recognized her as the one behind the incident that had spread through company gossip. But she wasn't there to hide, she was there to learn. She listened to every lesson, shared her story with the group, even volunteered during the role-play exercises. For the first time in years of working as a flight attendant, Rowena realized that serving passengers wasn't just about punctuality smiles or knowing the safety protocols. It was about empathy, about respect, about learning to shed assumptions and truly see the person behind each boarding pass. 3 weeks later, she returned to work. On her first flight after reinstatement, Rowena stepped into the aircraft cabin with a heart full of nervousness and hope. To every passenger she encountered, she smiled with new intent. She listened more carefully. She paused before reacting just long enough to reconsider and respond with understanding. Throughout the flight, no one knew she was the flight attendant who offended the airline's owner. But she knew, and that made her better little by little. The story of Silas Vaughn and Rowena Blair is a powerful reminder. Never judge someone by appearances. In today's world, especially in America where diversity and equity are deeply valued, prejudice still lurks in subtle forms. A seemingly minor decision, an unfair glance can become a lasting wound. This story is not just a lesson for the airline industry. It's a wake-up call for anyone in service and leadership, or simply anyone living in a multicultural society. Rowena made a mistake, but she didn't try to cover it up. She owned it, learned from it, and changed. And that is the spirit America has always believed in. A second chance for those who truly seek to make things right. There are moments in life that may seem insignificant. A glance, a decision, a single sentence, but they carry enough weight to alter the course of someone's destiny. The story you've just followed isn't merely about a flight attendant, or a soldier in uniform. It is a mirror reflecting how we often unconsciously judge others based solely on appearances. The journey of Rowena and Silas has shown us this prejudice is invisible, yet it can leave the deepest scars. But within our mistakes, if we are brave enough to face them and change, another door opens not only to make amends, but to become a better version of ourselves. Perhaps all of us have been Rowena at some point, casually making a comment or acting without thought, simply because we judge someone based on assumptions rather than truth. And perhaps we've also been Silas, carrying silent wounds, for being misunderstood, for not being recognized for our true worth. But what makes this story truly special is forgiveness. When someone who has been wronged chooses to forgive instead of retaliate, chooses dialogue over power, that is when true character shines through. If there is one thing to take away from this journey, let it be this message about kindness, empathy, and the way we treat one another in today's world. See others with respect. Don't let prejudice rob you of the chance to understand the extraordinary soul behind an ordinary appearance. If this story touched your heart, take a second to like the video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next meaningful story. Every share is a way we can spread humanity's values, making life a little warmer, a little more understanding. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We'll see you in the next story where every journey brings a lasting lesson and a reminder that everyone deserves a chance to change and to be loved.